Hello, good morning and good afternoon, depending where you're joining us from today. And welcome to Advocacy, Assessment, Accessibility, the Effective Work of Graduate Engaged Scholarship, which is part of Imagining America's 2021 National Gathering, The Shape of Us, Waterways and Movements. My name is Trina Van Skyndel, and I'm the Membership Director for Imagining America. I'm actually also a doctoral student myself at Michigan State University, studying community engaged practitioner scholar identity development for my dissertation. So I'm really excited to be here today to hear more from the presenters in this session as they engage us in dialogue around the social and emotional aspects of community engaged scholarship, particularly for graduate students across the arts, humanities, and humanistic social sciences. Before we get started, I do have a few logistical items to cover. First, the session offers closed captioning. To access the closed captioning, click on the CC button, which can be found at the bottom of your Zoom window. Second, I wanted to make sure you know that you'll have the opportunity to interact with the presenters and other participants in this session today. So to begin, we invite you to use the chat to introduce yourselves and also just to communicate with the presenters and other participants throughout the session. We'll also be doing breakout sessions today. So just know there'll be a chance to engage in reflective exercise to deepen your understanding of how accessibility, assessment, and advocacy can shape your own work. Finally, if you're on social media, we invite you to engage with us via Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, even LinkedIn. You can use hashtag IAGathering2021 in your posts. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Stephanie Maroney. Stephanie is the program manager for the Mellon Public Scholars Program at the University of California, Davis Humanities Institute. In this role, she helps graduate scholars shape the future of advanced humanistic research to be collaborative, impactful, and engaged with communities beyond the university. Stephanie has a PhD in cultural studies from UC Davis, and as a feminist, food studies, and science and technology studies scholar, her research focuses on cultural studies of the human microbiome and radical and relational approaches to fermentation. And I can personally speak to attending some really wonderful and thought-provoking virtual sessions over the past year with Stephanie and her collaborators, stemming from that collective inquiry into fermentation and food sovereignty. But I wanted to thank you, Stephanie, for being here today and bringing your thoughtful focus to engaging us on transformative possibilities for graduate education. And with that, I will now turn the session over to you.
Thank you, Trina. Thank you also to Mina and Erin and Papiro and Erica and all of the wonderful people at Imagining America who continue to create spaces for these kinds of conversations and bring together such a always wonderful group of humanists and artists and designers and advocates and activists. I just love this space and continue to feel really energized by it. And I'm really grateful that I, in my role now, get to bring graduate students to this space too, because I find that folks who are able to come into these gatherings get a lot out of the experience and get a lot out of the connections that they get by participating. So thanks to everyone for your work and for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now so that you can view the presentation that we prepared. If you're having any trouble seeing this or hearing, feel free to use the chat and I will make sure that I get your message, or I'm sure someone will from Imagining America. So thanks and welcome to this session we've titled Advocacy, Assessment, Accessibility, the Effective Work of Graduate Engaged Scholarship. The session came into being based really on the work of two of the people in this roundtable who did work last summer interviewing many graduate students, graduate public scholars about their work. And together we realized the urgency of really discussing the emotional and social aspects of community engaged graduate research. So I'm thankful that I'm seeing more and more in this space addressing, how do we do this work, or what can this work look like? But I just really appreciate that these graduate students themselves have brought the issue of the kind of emotional and affective labor that is a part of the work, which isn't always something that we talk about or that we offer resources for, honestly, in the kinds of programs that I run. So this might include processing traumatic events that happen to themselves or to their collaborators, advocating for marginalized communities, which in and of itself can be requires quite a bit of emotional capacity. Communicating the value of public work to academic audiences. It's not always well received. Engaged graduate scholars really undertake a range of effective work that goes unacknowledged. So this session is focusing really on 3 keywords that we think help to gather those range of experiences that can be felt individually and institutionally, and help to address this issue of the effective work that graduate scholars undertake. All right, so who are these graduate scholars? Well, I'm really happy to introduce them. And yeah, please feel free to turn on your video once I say your name. The first is Alana Hayes Stein, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology at the University of California, Davis. Her scholarship focuses on examining food bank organizational structures and equitable access to food. She also worked with Imagining America's Leadership and Learning Initiative last summer, looking at the institutional culture change and graduate student experiences with public scholarship. And she was a 2017 Mellon Public Scholar. The next is Lizbeth de la Cruz Santana, who is a graduate student in Latin American literatures and cultures with a designated emphasis on human rights at the University of California in Davis. Liz's dissertation focuses on childhood arrival migrants to the United States. She's a recipient of the UC President's Pre-Professoriate Fellowship, a Mellon Public Scholar from 2019, along with awards from Imagining America and the National Humanities Center, among others. She is the designer and coordinator of the Playas de Tijuana mural project, documented Dreams Without Borders digital storytelling project, and co-director of the Leave No One Behind mural project. She's a researcher, a digital storyteller facilitator for the Humanizing Deportation Project, and we're really grateful to have her expertise today. Also joining us is Brooke Kipling, a PhD candidate in the Spanish and Portuguese department at UC Davis, a member of the project also, Humanizing Deportation, and a 2021 Mellon Public Scholar. Brooke's research is informed by her experiences on the ground, whether in Chiapas or Tijuana, where theory is produced by migrants themselves. Working with the digital narrative form, Brooke facilitates the storytelling process with migrants through food. Her current research explores the ways in which Central American migrants narrate their existences outside of liberal humanist frameworks. Thank you for coming, Brooke. Chloe Brotherton is another one of our roundtable participants and a PhD candidate in linguistics. Her research focuses on how language is used by feminist and LGBT activist communities. She was a 2021 Mellon Public Scholar and worked with the San Joaquin Pride Center in Stockton, California. And finally, Melinda Adams is an Indigenous scholar activist, multidisciplinary researcher, community leader, educator, and environmental stewardship advocate. She belongs to the San Carlos Apache Tribe of Arizona and is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Native American Studies. Melinda also has projects with the Environmental Policy and Management Department and is currently pursuing a designated emphasis in environmental humanities. Melinda was a 2020 Mellon Public Scholar. All right, for our session today, we're going to, as I said, explore these 3 keywords, pairing together the members of this panel to address advocacy, assessment, and accessibility. And in each of those cases, the presenters will share a kind of individual experience. So this might be a personal story or something that has impacted them at the individual level, and also raise some of the institutional concerns or issues around the topic they're discussing. We'll then move into small group breakout rooms where we can explore these topics in more detail, and there will be some direction for those breakout rooms, but it'll be a chance for us to talk a little bit more because we want to acknowledge that we're talking about the kind of emotional, social, labor that we feel doing it. So we wanted to make sure we had a space for all of you to be able to share what that is, because we know it's going to bring something up for you. There's no avoiding that. So we hope that the small group could be a place where we could have those conversations and then return to a larger group discussion where we can share back about, things we found or resonances across the different experiences with an eye towards how we might change the institutions that produce these kinds of things, or what kinds of structures could we put in place in programs such as the Mellon Public Scholars Program, which I'll share in more detail, to better address this area that we have not acknowledged so far. So thanks for joining us on this journey. I'm going to go ahead and get going. The first keyword we're exploring is advocacy, and I'll address it first by talking about my role with the Mellon Public Scholars Program, and then Liz will take it over with some of her experiences. So the program that is being represented very well here today is a program that's been funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation at the UC Davis Humanities Institute since 2016. The program combines interdisciplinary teaching, grad fellowship support, which is a little more generous than some of the other support that grad students are available on campus, and that was intentional. I would say $5,000 is kind of the median summer research grant, and ours are $7,500 with an additional $400 to $500 to support project supplies. Students also have access to professional development opportunities within the program itself. We try to bring that into the space through guest lecturers in the seminar, and also by working with, in some cases, community partners who are in professional spaces in which the scholar themselves eventually wants to move as a kind of career development. They also receive faculty mentorship. A faculty person gets a small stipend to help students carry out their work, and we encourage them to, the graduate scholars that is, to reach out to faculty that aren't their principal advisors, both so that they can have greater exposure to the kinds of public scholarship that happens on campus, and greater exposure to faculty members that they might not otherwise have a chance to meet. The program's core purpose is to support a graduate student in carrying out a mutually beneficial, community-engaged research project with a community partner. The program so far has supported 68 fellows through either cohorts of 10 or 12, depending on the year. Over 70 faculty members at UC Davis have been engaged with the program either as faculty mentors or as co-instructors of the seminar or serving on our advisory board. And we've worked with over 60 community partners that are really from across our state, across our region, across our country, and across the world. We support international projects and we support international students, which is also something that is not always accessible to international students, is summer research funding for their projects. So we are very happy that this program's been able to do that. For the program, what scholars have to do is they can submit an application, a 3-page proposal that really lays out the contours of the project, and they can work either on an original project of their own and their partner's design. So that's really key, is that the scholar is kind of already in communication with a community partner, so that one of the evaluation criteria is this project actually mutually beneficial, right? And not just something the scholar is bringing to a community. So they can choose to do an original project, or they can actually work directly with one of our partners, meaning the DHI's community partners, on a project where we kind of set the contours of it already. These have been really attractive to students at the beginning of their process because they may have an interest in community engaged scholarship, but they don't already have those relationships built. So it's like, here's a project, here's a partner that the DHI is kind of responsible for maintaining ties with, and you can be a part of that relationship. It's also popular with students at the end of their experience who are looking for a kind of professional development experience that is still rooted in research, which is also unique, right? It's not only an internship, it's actually a research experience with professional mentorship tied in. So some of those partners have included California State Parks, the California Arts Council, Capital Public Radio, which is our NPR affiliate, the City of Davis Arts and Cultural Affairs, California Humanities, the Center for Sacramento History, and really many others. So in terms of advocacy, getting to the keyword here, I see my primary role as the program manager as gathering resources to support graduate students in doing this work. That's actually my favorite part of my job, is being here to talk with students, to help them troubleshoot, to navigate the bureaucracy, to figure out why they didn't get their money. I mean, all of these things they can cause so much stress, and to just have someone who's like, I will help you figure this out. I see that is just such an important role, and I would love to see more people in an administrative capacity helping to carry out those kinds of issues with students. Another thing, as a recent PhD and as a former Mellon Public Scholar myself, I really know how challenging it is to find financial support. That's a huge issue, but also to find mentorship and other kinds of university resources that may not be money, but like coursework, syllabi, smaller grants to like help me buy equipment or something like this to carry out work. Those things are really challenging, and they're not centralized in any one place. So it takes a lot of work to find them. And I also you need all of those components in order to have the capacity to take on a community engaged research project, which has all of these other dimensions of just what it is to work with a community in the first place. So all of this may or may not actually be related to your dissertation topic. So having to explain that to your advisor, explain that to a funder within the university, within your department, there's just so many battles, so many hills to climb, whatever metaphor you want, that students have to navigate just to get to the place before they carry out the work, which we know in and of itself is so complex and complicated and needs such tremendous support as the work is being done. So institutionally, I know that there is a lot we can do here. I'm really proud of the program, the Mellon Public Scholars Program, but I also know that there's a lot of learning that the program can do, especially in the realm that we're going to talk more about today. So I'm, representing the program in this capacity at the institutional level, but I just want to say that I'm really excited to hear more from all of you, as well as the roundtable participants, about how programs like this, which really are operating at this institutional level, can be transformed to better support the kind of work that grad students are doing and the kinds of emotional labor that becomes a part of the work and is often unacknowledged. So thanks. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Liz, who will continue to kind of share on this theme.
Thank you, Stephanie. That last part really resonated, and I think it's a really nice way to connect my reflection. So I wrote it down just because this is a very emotional topic as well. It has been very hard to do engaged work at UC Davis, not because the institution doesn't allow me to do the work, but because of the work that has been I've been able to do since 2016. So I'll begin reading, and hopefully during our sessions, we're able to engage in dialogue. So I'll begin. And reflecting on the meaning of advocacy as a public scholar who is also a woman of color doing engaged work with immigrant community groups, both in the US and in Mexico, bring to the forefront the emotional and social aspects of community engaged graduate scholarship, especially in a very traditional field such as my own, which is literature. I often find myself battling the idea of being seen as an outsider in my own field, as someone who, quote unquote, and I hear this all the time, can't do literature, and instead is boxed in the interdisciplinary category based on the community participatory projects I have directed and I am a part of. Yet perhaps unconsciously, I've come to embrace being multidimensional, and as a scholar once shared with me, a shapeshifter. But this abrir de ojos and awakening did not occur overnight. In my first 3 years as a PhD student at UC Davis, I learned to advocate for myself, and also for the type of scholarship I wanted to do, and the vision behind my activist-oriented projects linked to urgent community issues, especially those linked to deportation. My sentiments of not belonging and unworthiness of remaining in academia were dissolved thanks to the support and validation of the UC Davis Humanities Institute that funded my first project in 2017, and the Mellon Public Scholars Program, who basically transformed my idea of who I wanted to be in academia. So the spaces provided enriched my graduate school experience and allowed me to witness firsthand that a culture change in my institution was possible. Yet early in my academic career, I made a decision to live two intersected lives as a student. The first involves the reason why I decided to remain in graduate school to inform and impact public opinion and policy on immigration issues, especially those pertaining to deportation of immigrants who have exclusive ties and have made a life in the US. Initially, I thought of this in a very traditional sense, writing a doctoral dissertation that would eventually become a book publication. But my fieldwork as part of the Humanizing Deportation digital storytelling project since 2016 made me realize that solely writing about the deportation of US child arrivals would be an insufficient attempt, as my audience would be limited to academic spaces and scholars interested in the topic. And I really wanted to do something with community and for community. And I knew that would not be enough to really make a difference or worth the attempt to engage in reciprocity with the storytellers of the project who share their stories with us, who were vulnerable in sharing the trauma that they lived and the life-changing experiences that come along with being removed from a country that you see as your own. In a way, they planted the seeds of esperanza, the hope that our positionality as representatives of the institution and the access to resources could amount to a transformative change. Making the decision to embrace my public scholarship came with its obstacles. As you can imagine, graduate school in itself is very challenging, especially for first-generation students of color. And engaging in community-based projects adds another set of challenges, yet the fruits of the labor help balance this whole thing out. So diving into the catharsis of emotions that are triggered in acknowledging that my pursuit of remaining in the professorate will certainly require me to tirelessly continue to advocate for my engagement with community as part of my research and scholarship, to defend the vision of my projects, and to prove oftentimes that these quote unquote distractions are not keeping me from writing my dissertation, but instead are informing my arguments and are allowing me to do the type of scholarship I intend to pursue. You see, once you engage in fieldwork on an issue such as deportation, it is hard and almost impossible to not care. So how do we make it happen? So how do public scholars navigate not only the issues that they face in their department, the institution, and the field, and make space for the type of scholarship that we seek to do? So I learned a couple of things. And basically last year, I was able to name these things based on the research I was able to do with Alana for Imagining America. So the first term that comes to mind is code switch. So I see this as a surviving mechanism that allows us to be able to navigate not only academic spaces, but also allows us to communicate with our families and our community partners the work we do and the reasons why we do it. Although in the hopes to communicate to our different audiences, the essence of our work is not always fully represented. So in some way, I feel like I'm always not giving the work that I'm trying to do the merit that it demands, because you're always just changing who your audience is. So unfortunately, this also involves minimizing the capacity and importance of the collaborative work we do with community. In my experience, it is solely with community that I'm able to fully express the importance of the projects we are engaging in. And also it allows me to become even more inspired and have the potential to actually engage in the work that I'm doing as a grad student, but also in the field. So essentially, this code switch also helps us navigate the dangers we face while engaging in this work, especially in the field, yet real help and support to deal with the loss of community members, third-party interests, and death threats that force you to leave your projects and fields work are still things that we don't talk about. So the second thing that I've learned throughout these years is that in order to advocate for our scholarship, we have to make sure that our work is accessible to multiple audiences, whether that be in print, media, audio, or through art. So any medium that would allow us to interact with our community and the public itself. So any form of representation that can help support the scholarship we set out to do and the community projects we are executing requires its own set of tools. And for scholars who decide and wish to remain in academia, these skills can become important pillars for how we develop our teaching courses and how we can support our own students' journey, especially if they are interested in similar topics or engaging in research. So to close my reflection on advocacy, I leave you all with a few questions to consider, which I don't have the answers to either. So how can public scholars continue to advocate for themselves and their fields and in the institution? How can we continue to advocate for community interests and their own vision while navigating our own sets of challenges? And importantly, how can we continue to take care of our own emotional well-being while advocating for marginalized communities? And thank you everyone for your time.
All right, hi everyone. So the next keyword that we will be talking about is assessment. So Alana and I will be discussing this. Like I put in the chat, my video camera isn't working, so I apologize. You can't see me talking, but if my audio becomes unclear, please let me know because sometimes my computer mic is a little weird. Anyways, so Alana and I focused in our reflection about basically assessing modes of assessment in graduate education. So how do institutions, programs, departments assess graduate students' progress, whether they're ready to graduate, whether they're ready to qualify, etc. And how does that fit in with public scholarship? So one thing that Alana and I talked about, and that Alana and Liz saw in their research and just what we've seen in more informal conversations with other graduate students who have engaged in public scholarship, is feeling some limitations and restrictions based on these timelines and milestones that different programs have. So generally, you know, you have to pass certain exams, write certain papers, get a committee together, get the committee to approve you to write your dissertation. And your dissertation also oftentimes has a certain structure. And oftentimes these structures really aren't conducive for public scholarship. And when a graduate scholar brings up the possibility of doing public scholarship for these milestones, they might get discouraged by their mentor or advisor that it's not, quote, real research. But also, we've also noticed that sometimes the graduate students can internalize these notions of what research should be, what their dissertation or qualifying paper should be, and so they don't even ask if they can use their public scholarship work for these milestones. And that kind of leads into our second theme that we saw coming up, which is kind of a lack of flexibility and creativity in terms of what these milestones could look like, what published papers could look like. You know, that there is this idea that a dissertation must be a book-length manuscript, and if it's not that, it's not a dissertation. And so you need to fit your research to fit that, and you need to please the people on your committee in order to graduate and get your PhD. And so we found that a lot of people feel really constrained in that format, that they can't use their public scholarship work to meet these milestones. And so then they're doing this public scholarship work outside of their, you know, graduate program milestones in their already limited time and energy and emotional capacity outside of what's required by the program. This also ties into another theme that we saw coming up, which was that public scholarship really emphasizes collaboration with community partner, collaboration with other scholars, interdisciplinarity, whereas most graduate student programs in terms of assessment really emphasize individualism. While there are definitely cases where graduate students can collaborate with other researchers to publish, to present, etc., you can't really submit a co-written dissertation or a co-written qualifying paper. You can't take a qualifying exam with someone else. So it seems that most of these milestones you have to prove basically as an individual that somehow you merit the title of researcher. And also, when thinking about collaboration in more traditional modes of research with like a community partner, with subjects, participants, etc., in our experience in the social science, Alana and I, as well as other people that we've talked to, especially in social sciences, it seems to be there's this paradigm that a researcher enters, makes relationships with the participants, gets the data, then exits the field, and that relationship does not continue. Again, looking really at the individualism of how does this relationship, this timed relationship, benefit the researcher in their career, and furthering their milestones versus continuing this affective relationship through time. The idea is get done with your research, your data collection, move on to the next thing. That also ties into, we were thinking about the CV as a form of assessment as well. Not in the same way that like a comprehensive or qualifying exam is, but a CV basically is a way to assess you for different fellowships, for example, for jobs. And so, you know, thinking about where does public scholarship fit on a CV? How do you describe it? And oftentimes talking to like an advisor or committee member of, okay, cool, that's some cool stuff you're doing with that community partner, but like, how is that going to help you get a job? You know, or have different people within the Mellon Public Scholars Program have told stories of telling their committee members like, oh yeah, I'm doing this project with the Mellon Public Scholars Program, I'm a fellow, and them getting really excited about the name of like being a Mellon Public Scholar, and that the fact that we got funding or that we have a fellowship, but really not interested in the actual work that we're doing. So that's just some of the experiences and themes, both in the research that Alana and Liz conducted, as well as more informal conversations with other public scholars. But now Alana is going to talk about kind of the effective impact on graduate public scholars, as well as some of the thoughts we have about what this could look like in the future. How can we rebuild graduate education? Thank you. Here's Alana.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Yeah, so building on Chloe's discussion of these structures and forms of assessment that don't really make space for graduate students doing public scholarship, we want to unpack some of the emotions that come up as graduate students feel torn between their public scholarship and the program requirements that they have to do. Some of the emotions that come up with these tensions between public scholarships and often not just public scholarship, but students' own communities and identities as well. So as we talked about earlier, Liz and I have done some research through Imagining America, interviewing graduate students in the arts, humanities, and social sciences at UC Davis about their public scholarship experiences and graduate student experiences. So in that work, and also in Chloe and I's own discussions about the emotions around this work, we discussed some of the emotions that come up, including frustration, discouragement, the feeling of being powerless, internal conflict, apathy, and misunderstanding. However, we also saw that when the structures do support public scholarship, it can also be really inspiring for students. So I'm going to share with you just a few quotes from some of the scholars that Liz and I interviewed about their emotional experiences with assessment with graduate public scholarship. So first, one scholar pointed out that, quote, because the community engaged work kind of demands interdisciplinarity, then you also are doubling or tripling your chances of being in spaces where people don't understand what you're doing, end quote. So the scholar really unpacks how even through the communal aspect and the interdisciplinarity of the work, it leads the scholar to be exposed to more experiences and more places of tension where people don't value and don't understand the work that they're doing. Another scholar described the feeling of being, quote, overwhelmed can sometimes come up because you're balancing a couple of deadlines. You have maybe your regular kind of deadlines, whether it be you're on the quarter system or you're on the semester. So you've got that. That has its own life cycle and you manage it. Then you throw in public scholarship and it has different demands, but timings that are right for the university are not right for everyone else. So sometimes you can get overwhelmed, end quote. So we see with this scholar, they talk about these competing deadlines between the university milestones and the community that they're working with and trying to be a part of. However, we also saw that when the assessments and structures do support public scholarship, it can be great. So one scholar said, quote, "If you're really into what you're doing, then it's very inspiring. It's a very inspiring process to keep learning and growing and going more in depth and having the support through fellowships and faculty. And being able to go on that path is amazing to have support to do that. And to see it till the end, till you feel it's really done and you have a really great understanding. It's an amazing feeling," end quote. So we see through these, the scholars' experiences that when that support is there, when those structures and assessments do make room for public scholarship, that it really can be a great experience, bringing about really positive emotions. So now I'd like to move on to some of the things that Chloe and I discussed in terms of reimagining graduate student assessment. So we talked about some of the negatives before and how some of these assessment structures don't make room for public scholarship. And now we want to talk about how we can reimagine these assessment structures to think about how they can make room for public scholarship. So first, we'd like to discuss how we can rethink assessment to make space for more emphasis on collaboration with other academics and with the community. So we need to move beyond the individualistic culture to recognize that knowledge cannot be produced alone. Knowledge production is inherently a collective effort, and we'd like for the structures to make space for that and also make space for sharing the credit for knowledge production. So it doesn't become scholars going into a community, creating knowledge together, and then having to come back into the university and claim the credit for that knowledge to move through their programs. We'd like to make space to recognize the collective efforts of knowledge production. We'd also like to change structures to allow public scholarship work to be more accepted as part of milestones, such as theses and dissertations. So how can we rethink the structures of these major papers, or what are currently papers? So we'd like to incite a conversation about what is being assessed in a dissertation and a thesis, and what should be assessed and how. So we'd like to break down the goal of these milestones to rebuild them in ways that still reflect rigor, but allow for other avenues and ways to do this. So we've seen that the dissertation in some disciplines, particularly in the physical sciences and increasingly the social sciences, has morphed from manuscript into a 3-article model in many departments. So we've seen that these changes in what a dissertation can be have already taken place, but how might the dissertation be changed to make room for public scholarship? How can we reimagine the dissertation to make space? We'd also like to see more funding. So more funding opportunities for public scholarship we view is really important in terms of graduate student assessment. So graduate student assessment is often kept separate from discussions of funding without recognizing the way that financial precarity impacts graduate student work, particularly many first-generation graduate students and graduate students of color and people from marginalized economic backgrounds. So how do these structures of funding really affect the way that graduate students are able to perform in the assessment parts of graduate school? We'd also like to see more year-round funding that really takes into consideration that public scholarship cannot be done for a small period of time, but really takes time, and that you can't just exit the community after you've started that relationship. And we'd like to see more funding that's supportive of collaborative work. We'd also like to see coursework and course assessments that prepare scholars to do public work with the public. So reimagining these smaller forms of assessment to also include public scholarship. We'd also like to direct more attention to ethics and ethical considerations that move beyond the institutional review board. So within the institutional review board, we heard from scholars that there needs to be more flexibility with ethical protocols to allow for community engaged work. So I heard from scholars doing participatory action research who really had trouble communicating that to the IRB and fitting it within the IRB's guidelines, even though it was really based off of what the community wanted in terms of ethics. We'd also like to see more attention to ethical guidelines that really center the well-being of communities. So focusing on community well-being and the rights of the community as central to the ethics of doing public scholarship and any scholarship, in fact. We'd also like to see more support and flexibility for the emotional labor and graduate students' mental health. So doing public scholarship comes with a lot of emotional labor, as we're talking about throughout this session. And we'd like to see more leniency taken into account for both the emotional labor and more support for how to navigate all of these emotions that come up as well. So during the pandemic, we saw many extensions were made and more flexibility was given around graduate program assessments to take into account some of the mental health impacts of the pandemic. And we'd like to see those flexibilities made a little bit more permanent. So these are just some of the structures we wanted to focus on. And through reimagining these structures, we hope that we can create a more supportive space for graduate public scholarship in general. So now I'm going to hand it off to Melinda and Brooke, who are going to talk about accessibility.
Thank you, Alana and Chloe. That was wonderful. And I think we're all buzzing. The chat is blowing up. We're all really excited by the ideas you put forth. Thank you. Yes, and we'll move into the kind of final third of our session with Melinda and Brooke.
All right, so we are tackling the final A of our 3 A's here, which is accessibility. We're going to begin with Melinda, who's a PhD candidate, Mellon Scholar in Native American Studies, who's going to talk about it from a personal perspective, and then I'll also move into talking about it from a personal perspective to kind of bring it together into kind of an institutional question in academia, et cetera. So starting with you, Melinda.
Great, thank you, Brooke. So it was really great to be a part of the Mellon Public Scholars cohort and just overall program, in that you have these intellectual and personal exchanges about the work of community engaged research and scholarship. And Brooke and I got to talking about the concept of access and whom has access to the research that we're conducting, the data that we retrieve. What does that look like, and how is that different from the folks that come into the Mellon Public Scholars work? And so with my research in particular, I work with Indigenous communities in California. And given the long history of empirical and ethnographic research that has been conducted in our communities, there's a strong sense of distrust, as I imagine and have heard from other underrepresented communities as well, this long stigma of academically faced and engaged research. So I come to Native American Studies, a humanity-based disciplines, from a STEM field. So my personal reflections are coming from environmental sciences, where there's not too many conversations revolving original stewards of these lands and how that is a science in itself, and where that fits into not only history, but also how we're going about learning about sciences and on the edge of new research techniques within the science fields. I have degrees in that sense, but I realize that discipline, not everybody in it, but as a structure, it very much forces you to leave your whole self at the door. Sometimes we hear it in bias-based research. We hear that when going through the IRB process. So it's very matter of fact. And personally, I feel, and I'm only speaking for myself here, but I feel like there's a lot that's missed when you don't bring your whole self, authentic self, and you don't reflect those authentic experiences of the communities that you're engaging in. There's a lot that's missed. And hopefully my research is an example of that, an extension of that, but nonetheless, so yes, leaving your epistemologies, your ontologies, your sets of being, kind of leaving it at the door, it was really difficult for me. And so when I came into the Native American Studies department here at UC Davis, I share this with Stephanie all the time, it's almost inherent that we engage in community-based research that's with, by, and for our communities. having that opportunity to see what research could and should look like when it's done with care and honors the 4 R's, like respect, responsibility, reciprocity, relationality. Those 4 R's, they're deeply embedded in Native American studies. And I would argue that, well, I would present that they're also present in the work that we're doing as Mellon public scholars as well. And so having that be part of my experience has been helpful in elevating the type of research that we're doing. But it also brings into question, what does accessibility look like for the communities that we're working with? It can't always be a 200-page dissertation that's heavily written in technical language, with technical findings that aren't going to benefit our communities if they can't understand, or if it's written in a way that leaves them out. So Mellon Public Scholars goes a long way in letting us bring our creative senses to how we go about consulting and collaborating with our communities, and then really envisioning something that's beneficial to them. So a common theme that I'm seeing is digital storytelling, arts, artistic expressions, things that really resonate with our peoples and our community members as another way of empowering them with things they probably already know, but things that are important. So I really appreciated the digital storytelling aspect and whom that speaks to, because I'm sure a lot of our community members, they could care less about a 2 or 3 year grant. They're worried about they're concerned about the long-term effects that are affecting their community. So how does this build upon with that? How does that benefit them in the short term? These short-term research projects that universities do and carry out. All that to say is the question of accessibility, of how we go about trying to do research in the right way that's forward-thinking enough to have our communities in mind, and really shaping what that looks like. I think a fair bit of us do the best that we can to engage with our communities at every step, every stage of the research process. And I feel like we contort it to where it's their, it's their, what they're wanting to see happen, or it's their goals that we're trying to meet. And so my journey from science into humanities, being a Mellon public scholar, and now being able to carry that emotionally and carry that responsibility is a big thing within our community engaged work. So how do we go about doing that? And I think Brooke brought up a really great question about accessibility, like how does that differ across the board, and how do we go about that in a good way that's benefiting our communities? So I will go ahead and pass it off to Brooke to share a bit about her personal reflections.
Thanks, Melinda. Yeah, I think thinking of accessibility across the board and what the different groups with the different A's have all gotten to are questions of that kind of lead back to health. And when we think of health, emotional, mental health, but physical health as well. And I want to address this from a point of the present of COVID-19, 2021, and where we're at, and how that as scholars, students, teachers, professors, etc., has impacted us, our communities, and the relations we have with them, and our relationship with the university. Starting with like a personal story, this summer, I was a Mellon public scholar, and I was working in Tijuana, Mexico, and I was working with populations that were more vulnerable to COVID because of the lack of access to vaccines. I, throughout my time there, had ethical questions of protocol with collaborators in Tijuana, with the people who I was working with who were not vaccinated. And those questions still remain about protocol and how can we have a standard of kind of care between ourselves and the community when the university doesn't extend that care to us much of the time. And when for people who are autoimmune compromised or have mental health issues and can't be present, how do we even create an ethical kind of protocol when we don't have that support in an institutional sense? I got COVID this summer working in Tijuana, and I was going to leave back here. I had to pay rent and move in. Unfortunately, I didn't have funding from the university, nor extra project funding to pay for my COVID tests that were rapid, to pay for my quarantine that had to extend my stay, and then have to put on top of that my rent as a graduate student. So thinking of accessibility as economically is huge, because that impacted my mental health and my physical health. And thinking of how we can support our communities and have, as Melinda said, those 4 R's when we don't even have the support to maintain our own health is a question that has constantly come up throughout my collaborations in community, not just abroad in perhaps more precarious situations, but at the university itself, where we're now thousands of us gathered in person teaching, and COVID is still running. And so thinking of how we can come up with a protocol with our community, and especially in COVID-19, how that is necessary, but how that should be something we think about beyond a pandemic, because having a protocol around health and care is something that is not, we don't have the time given to us in our studies. We don't enter these academic sites thinking about protocols of how we're going to care for each other, whether we're in a pandemic or not. So thinking of accessibility through the lens of health and through the lens of how we need the economic means, but also going to accessibility through the idea of study, as many people have thought about, and working on thinking of what Stephen Harvey and Fred Moten in the Undercommons on radical Black study have taught us, is that basically, how do we make studying more subversive and bring studying outside of the classroom to be more accessible, and think of studying as not rooted in academia and theory, but studying as rooted in our everyday relations. So moving on to this more academic framework of studying, but cutting that kind of tie to academia and not settling with studying in the university. So this summer and past summers and throughout my work, working with collaborators who aren't tied to academia, who don't have a responsibility or accountability to academia or these institutions, it becomes hard to balance that kind of responsibility as a graduate student when we are still kind of mediators for the university and we are still accountable to them. And we're split between caring about our community and about our projects, and we're also split between owing something back to the university. And should that split of accountability really exist when we're talking about public scholarship, we're trying to be in our communities, and that's where our relations are informing anything academic that we do. So coming back together in the end, accessibility, access to studying, access to the ability to create an ethical protocol around health, be it mental or physical, with your communities. When you don't have necessarily that support from the university, and you return to a site where the protocol is so low that it's compromising those who can't be in this physical setting of the university. And we kind of put these questions on this slide here to bring in kind of a broad, to engage you all with broad questions on, like, who is your research for, and the nuances of university accessibility, who is left out, and can we have a true kind of accountability and true accessibility if we're still kind of accountable to the university before our communities, or in the end, that's who we have to return to. And finally, thinking of access and accessibility, I think Melinda touched on this. Does the university always need to have access to our projects, to our communities? Do we always have to publish, share information, share relations? That really should just stay in one place and should be funded either way. So do access and accessibility, thinking of those in many lights. We kind of wanted to wrap this up, leaving you with some big questions about those and thinking really with our communities, and what are the possibilities being still tied to the university. So thank you.
Thank you. With always a good resource, decolonizing methodologies, beautiful. That's actually those questions are not on here, but they are great to consider as we move into the breakout discussions, these specific questions about who your research is for, who gets left out, what accessibility means to you, and the difference between access and accessibility, and how that can mean different things in your context and for the university and for your community, I think are wonderful questions. I have so many things to say and think with, and I think the next step for us is to move into some smaller breakout room discussions so that we can talk about them and share a little bit about our experiences, and then come back and kind of just have a reflection. So really, this isn't homework breakout room. It's let's connect with each other. Let's make some community between the folks in the room. So we're asking you to introduce yourself and share a keyword that most kind of resonates strongly for you. And that could, be any of our A's. And then share, if you can, an experience of your own effective work with engaged scholarship, or if you have more of a mentor role, something you've observed in others. And then if we can, as a small group, consider how we might begin to address these concerns individually and institutionally, or the incommensurability of them, right? The unaddressing of them is also something we could share. Not all problems can be fixed. So let's go ahead and move into those spaces now. I think we've set it up in a way so that there should be 3 to 4 people in a room and one of us as a member of the room. And again, we'll just introduce ourselves and the keyword, share an experience of this effective work, and consider these larger issues. And then we'll return in about 15 minutes to have our larger group discussion. And Erin, thank you for helping me with the breakout rooms. Hi, everyone. Thanks for that abrupt return. That was a really wonderful conversation. I'm sure it felt that way across everyone. I'm going to share my screen just briefly so you can be reminded of some of the questions, but I'm really happy to hear whatever came up in the sessions. So we were kind of talking about shared experiences or experiences of effective work, from effective feelings and engaged scholarship, and how we might be to address them. And yeah, I think that's where my group started, is this how do we begin to address these things? What's the role of the institution, and maybe who are some other actors that we haven't yet talked about, namely faculty? So I'll just leave this up here for a second so folks can kind of absorb it, but then I'm going to stop sharing and just really open it up for any group that wants to share back about some of the main takeaways from their session. All right. And I'll go first. How about that? It's my idea. I should go first. So yeah, we talked about several things, but I thought it was interesting. Something we can talk about, and something I think I've heard talked about quite a bit is who's gumming up the wheel here, right? It's like we have grad students on board. We have, institutes who have funding, they're on board, they're providing the structures. And we kind of talked about administrators sometimes who are, want to put resources into this kind of work or want to create new initiatives. And that at some institutions, it actually seems like there's a lot of administrative level support for like DEI initiatives and other kinds of public work. And in some cases, it's faculty who might be holding on to these older ideas or these very specific ideas about what scholarship is supposed to look like. Or maybe on your institution, it's vice versa, right? You've got maybe a lot of faculty who are mobilized around it, but the administration is not ready to invest. But at the same time, I feel like I noticed some issues in either of those dynamics where if there's a lot of administrative level attention to something, it doesn't always mean that grad students are going to be able to access those resources or like that they want to go to another workshop, unless it's really something specific to the work that they're doing. So there can be a real disconnect between how that actually benefits. And then if you have faculty maybe who are really on board and supportive, those folks can quickly become overworked, or the emotional labor involved in being a faculty mentor for students who are going through such kind of traumatic work. So maybe just I'm not sure if other folks talked about that level, but I would be really interested to hear maybe around how faculty are and aren't a part of these conversations.
Well, I'll just say what great presentations and also a really deep conversation. And in our group, we kind of ended with a conversation about the layers of support necessary. And most of us who've done dissertations have seen committee members fight with each other. So it's not just the direct support linearly, like to and from student to faculty, but the mess that can happen in departments that aren't fully on board and supported with one another. So I thought that was a really thoughtful conversation we had. And I guess what I'll kind of add on to that is I know from Liz and Alana's really deep research that those that are really supportive faculty are often overtapped and exhausted because they're supporting so many. And so then some of those, horizontal tensions come from that feeling of not being supported as a faculty member when you're supporting so many students. So then that creates some of the kind of departmental tensions that don't help the student at all either. So kind of thinking of the system, the department level system.
We talked a little bit about that too in terms of faculty and departments and how gradually like different departments, each department is its own sort of world too. So like lots of ways it's hard to get into that department. And I mean, it's hard to see what's happening. And so if you're an administrator and you want to see more community engaged work, like how do you do that? You can say I think somebody put it in the chat that you can say we want to recognize community engaged work as scholarship, as research, not as service, and that's good. But I think like individually, like getting departments to see it as valuable is like a slow process. We mentioned like the philosophy department that didn't even want to be part of the Mellon graduate program at Tulane. I mentioned them, and because like initially they said we don't even want our grad students to do it, and then their grad students started applying, and we've taken 2 so far, and the first one he's interested in international in immigration studies, and so in immigration ethics especially, so, and works with a small grassroots organization here in town, and so like that work has complicated his dissertation and has made it, and I think it's clear to the people in philosophy that this has enriched his experience and has given him a depth that is rare in, you know, people who are studying ethics in philosophy departments. And another graduate student, Siobhan Lash, she's doing environmental ethics and is very much, you know, is deeply working with like the Environmental Law Center and with grassroots organizations. And I think gradually the philosophy department is like, oh yeah, this stuff's actually, they can start to see it, you know. And I think and I don't think we've won them over. I mean, they're still like the life of the mind. We don't need this stuff, some of them, but it's gradual. And I think it helps for them, for faculty to see how it actually works in some field in their disciplines.
I definitely want to hear from others, but I wanted to also, before we spend all this time talking about faculty, just re-raise the issue that Brooke brought up about economic accessibility and how, I mean, what if we're talking about all these strains on faculty as mentors and on, you know, departments and then on graduate students themselves, and of course wouldn't solve it all, but if graduate students were able to have a safety net, an economic safety net, to, you know, they could maybe be able to better care for their own needs because they weren't in such a constant state of crisis. And I think that there's just like this baseline that needs to be addressed. And Malika had brought up this great point that we often go to the university to say, you know, take care of our grad students or demand something, when we could also be demanding that of our governments, of our states, you know, that the universities become the site for these battles, when we really just need grad students they need a safety net. And then we can ask them to do things that are so much harder and need their own resources. But without that, it's really just exacerbating the issues. Did another group want to share any kind of major points of discussion? We have just, I think, 2 minutes left together. All right, I see the thank yous have begun. Yeah, thank you so much to everyone, especially to Liz and Alana and Chloe and Melinda and Brooke. Appreciate your intellectual generosity, your collaborations together as a group. This has been really wonderful. And just doing all the work of synthesizing this was great. And I think we've all learned from it, and have more problems maybe than we started out with now. We opened the bag of worms. Is it a bag of worms? A bucket? I don't know. Thanks again to IA organizers. I really appreciate all of your work making this possible. And I think Trina has a closing to lead us into the next session.
Yeah, thank you again, Stephanie, to you as well. And also again to the UC Davis Mellon Public Scholars, just for all of your vulnerability today, you know, and sharing your stories and experiences and research. So also just thank you to the participants again as well for your participation. We will be taking a short break before our next session, which is actually going to be the lightning talks from Imagining America's Publicly Active Graduate Education, or PAGE, fellows. So those will start at 1:15 p.m. Pacific time or 4:15 p.m. Eastern time. And during the lightning talks, the PAGE fellows are going to share about their current and emerging work. So just to kind of keep that conversation going, if you're interested in graduate student engaged scholarship, this will be a session you'll also want to attend. So take a look in the chat. We just dropped the link with more details for how to join that session, and also our closing session. So thank you everyone again. Good to see you, and hopefully we'll see you in our next session.